Good evening. Good evening. Thank you for the call and response there. Good evening. Thank you all for coming. My name is Andrew Rieser. I'm Professor of History in the History, Government, and Economics Department at Dutchess Community College. I have the privilege of being the holder of this year's Handel Family Endowed Faculty Chair to perpetuate the legacy of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. Now is the moment for me to ask you all to silence, or better yet, completely turn off cell phones, any other devices that make a sound or might otherwise distract you from taking in the full experience of this evening's lecture and the intellectual riches that we can gain from it. I'm glad to see so many of my students. I have seen you. Welcome. I'd like, again, a special appeal to them. Please stay through the Q&A. We'll get you out of here by 8:30 or so. My thanks to DCC President Peter Jordan and also Interim Executive Director of the DCC Foundation, Anna Parra, along with Stefano Timpano and the entire staff of the DCC Foundation. It's been a pleasure to work with you all in the past months in preparing for this event. And it's been a very much a privilege to work with you. And if we could, please join me in thanking them for everything they did to make this event possible. This lecture series has been around for a while now. It's got to be at least 15 years. I should actually have, being the historian, I should have the number. No, it's somewhere around there. It has now, for well over a decade, been made possible by the Handel family, whose wisdom, foresight, and generosity has enriched the life of this college for that time. The Handel family's example of engaged citizenship, intellectual curiosity, their understanding of how access to education is essential to a functioning democracy. They could contribute their time and resources to another college, let's say, in Poughkeepsie. They chose Dutchess Community College because they understand how important it is to have that equality of opportunity in a functioning democracy. Their deep and abiding faith in the community college's mission, all of this has been an inspiration to me. Shirley Handel has been living out these principles for decades. We're deeply appreciative of her support. Please join me in, Shirley, could you wave? Just so we know who we're talking about here. There's Shirley. Please join me in thanking Shirley Handel. Our speaker tonight is Dr. John Schmitz. He received his Ph.D. in U.S. History from American University in 2007. He's the author of a book. Oh, and before I give you the title of the book, quick programming note. There will be an opportunity to purchase his book after the lecture, and an opportunity for you to approach the author and get an inscription. So a book purchase opportunity and a book signing is going to be right after this lecture. The book is entitled Enemies Among Us: The Relocation, Internment, and Repatriation of German, Italian, and Japanese Americans During the Second World War. He's also co-author of an International History Review article in 2022 entitled A Crisis of Identity, Good Aliens, Bad Americans, or Bargaining Chips, U.S. Civilian Exchanges with the Third Reich During World War II. As some of these quite fascinating titles point out, in his scholarship, Dr. Schmitz's scholarship, we find an historian examining the causes, conditions, and consequences of America's selective relocation and internment of its own residents and U.S. citizens. But his work is also a social history. So it's a legal and political history. It's also social history because of the way that he explores the effects of internment on those who experienced it. Why might it be useful to talk about a history of mass internment right now? So I debated about whether I should, it's of course a perfect question to ask, I think. It probably answers itself, and maybe I should just leave it at that. But because I can't resist, let me offer just two thoughts, very general, two thoughts about the relevance of this, the usability, I guess, of this history in this present. First of all, it complicates the legacy of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. Deporting or incarcerating tens of thousands of people, including American citizens who committed no crime, is probably not one of FDR's best moments. And it's also something that 45 years later, another American president named Ronald Reagan would apologize for, right, in an official U.S. apology in the Rose Garden in the mid-1980s. It was also a cause of conflict between Franklin and Eleanor. Eleanor privately opposed the policy, couldn't say so publicly because, of course, the administration's and her husband's position, and then worked behind the scenes to gain the release of some Japanese-American internees. And thus, we have a complicated story when it comes to the Roosevelts are complicated persons in a complicated moment. And this adds to the fascination that we have in our understanding, deepens our understanding of the legacy, the complex legacy of the Roosevelts. Secondly, looking at this history right now complicates our understanding of the present. History doesn't repeat, of course, but it does rhyme. In this instance, I would say in five-part harmony. I remember some of my students will roll their eyes because they've heard me do this a couple times already. But in promoting this event, encouraging them to attend, I offered the following tease. In this lecture, you'll learn about a moment when armed agents of the federal government, on orders from the president and in the name of national security, began rounding up, incarcerating, and deporting not just hundreds or thousands, but hundreds of thousands of people. And I'm not talking about the present. I'm talking about the World War II. Now, analogies are not comparisons. World War II and now are utterly different moments in time. Utterly different moments in time. So analogies are not comparisons, right? But analogies are fascinating, and they help us deepen our awarenesses, moral, social, historical, sociological, legal awarenesses of life in our constitutional republic. And so it's, I think, a really interesting topic to think about right now. It's hard to imagine a speaker better suited to help us contextualize this topic than Dr. Schmitz. In addition to being a published author on the topic, he's also the son of a Second World War II internee, grandson of a German-American internee. His journey has been both a personal and academic one. And again, a chance perhaps to engage him on this topic. Purchase his book, and he'll get a chance to have him sign it after the lecture. Finally, one more aspect of Dr. Schmitz's bio, and then I promise I'll get off the stage, and we look forward to hearing from him. He is a professor at a community college, a professor of history at Northern Virginia Community College in Annandale, Virginia. I think it's worth noting that this is the first time in this lecture series that we've had a colleague from a community college grace this stage and give an address as part of the Handel Roosevelt lecture series. Considering that nearly half of all college students in America attend a community college, like we're not, like we're the majority practically, right? Maybe it's high time that we had a faculty member, colleague at a community college give this address. Perhaps we should have done so sooner. All right, without any more delay, please join me in welcoming to Dutchess Community College and to the stage, Dr. John Schmitz.
So wanted to say, first of all, thank you to Dr. Jordan, Dr. Rieser, and the Dutchess Community College Foundation, and to all of you for sharing part of your evening and part of your life, just be it a short bit, with me tonight and going through a presentation here. As Dr. Rieser mentioned, the topic is both academic for me, but very personal. I can get choked up. My father died a few years ago as the book was coming out. See, already personal and difficult in a way. And he was so proud of what I was doing because it not only sort of was a way to show off academically, but a way, I think, to honor him and the sacrifices he and my aunt, who's in the audience, made at that time. And then to turn a negative into a positive. And I recollected, too, in talking with my Aunt Louise, that as a young child, I remember being embarrassed a bit and also ashamed, why my dad, why was he in a camp? What did he do? What did my grandfather do? And those questions pushed me to ask more questions when I was an undergrad at UNC Chapel Hill. No one had written on the subject at all. So I couldn't write on it. There's just nothing there. And when I was working on my master's degree, I was put in touch with Art Jacobs, who was instrumental in introducing me to primary sources that had to do with the topic. And I felt like a fish out of water writing my thesis because there was nothing written about the subject. And I hoped, oh my gosh, as it was coming out, what would other historians think? Did I totally blow it? How did it go? I'd have no idea. It was just this unnerving moment, and it was fine. And then I went on to write a dissertation, and then finally the book and so forth. So if you'll indulge me for a little bit, I just wanted to talk about some of the key concepts and ideas. And then, as Dr. Rieser well mentioned, many of the themes, concepts, ideas, as well as actions we see all around us today. So, you might think a 1798 act, like the Alien Enemies Act, is arcane. It's 1798, who cares? But these events have a way of being resuscitated. So a Sedition Act, an Espionage Act, and so forth. So without further ado, let me start to go through the PowerPoint with you, and then I want to introduce you to the German-American Internee Coalition website, which is this treasure trove of primary sources, personal stories. There are others here who are descendants of internees, and they are fascinating stories. So I'd encourage you to visit the website. There's just tons of primary sources, photographs, family stories, links to other information. And it's like an onion. The more you learn, the more you just start to realize these are like really deep stories about people like us, I think, ordinary people in extraordinary times. So without further ado that way, let me go ahead and show you a few things. So and I tend to like to walk around, but I think I'm tethered to this, so I like to move. But I'll let you look at these. These are some quotes that I don't think all of them made it into the Russian one didn't, but the top two did. Nietzsche's quote, "What things are called is incomparably more important than what they are." Like savage, the most common adjective for Native Americans. So if you start to conceptualize a group of people by using just a few words, it simplifies what just isn't simple. And any sort of horrible system, I think, which internment certainly was, it begins with ideas, and then what do you call people? What do you call things? Illegal aliens, enemies, or refugees, right? The words matter. So I really like Nietzsche's quote. It is so important. And then the book of Leviticus. And it's not just Old Testament, by the way. There are 30-some-odd places in the Bible, Old and New Testament, that mention how to treat the outsider, the foreigner, whatever term you want to use, as yourself. And Leviticus, by the way, you'll see at the end, supposedly God makes this emphatic statement, I am the Lord your God. So what greater authority, right? And these are our neighbors, right? We're all sojourners on the planet. And then, because I'm a huge Rush fan, not the person, but the Canadian rock group, there's a song and part of the lyrics from The Enemy Within, which for me resonated. I made the song even more special. So things crawl in the darkness that imagination spins. Needles at your nerve ends crawl like spiders on your skin, pounding in your temples in the search of adrenaline. And then the last part, every muscle tense, defense, the enemy within, which just made me think, of course, of Crystal City and all these other camps. So anyway, thank you to the rock group Rush. And then during World War II, just sort of go top down, to ensure the safe return of Americans overseas to rid the Western Hemisphere of dangerous or unwanted enemy nationals, the United States would act on the behalf of dozens of nations. We would round up thousands of persons from Central and South America, charge them with illegal entry after grabbing them, and then exchange them for Guatemalans and El Salvadorans and Nicaraguans and Costa Ricans and on and on and on. The United States acting on the behalf of other nations, at least a dozen or more, and then exchanges that occurred during the war. And I'll explain relocation and internment in just a moment, but there are remarkable similarities between the two processes. So relocation just meant that there were war zones that were created, exclusion zones, right? West Coast under General DeWitt, East Coast under General Drum. So there was great purview, East Coast, West Coast, and by the way, and Gulf Coast as well, that any person, citizen or not, could be removed under Executive Order 9066, which was February 19th, 1942. Most people think, which I thought when I went to high school, I was introduced to a little of this as far as the Japanese, but not much. I thought it only applied to Japanese, but if you read the text carefully, which is why texts are so important, primary sources, right? What do they say? And then what do they not say? You know, omission, as we were talking about earlier. And it doesn't mention any specific group. It doesn't specifically focus on the Japanese. It could be any person, you know, deemed dangerous, anyone, you, me. And I don't know the exact number. I've been looking for years. The estimates are from a low of 20,000 to a high of 40,000 Germans, mainly Germans, but some Italians too, were relocated from both coasts. And a few Japanese, a handful, from the East Coast as well. But under General Drum's command, he had the authority to potentially remove millions of people. For lots of reasons, he didn't. Disruption to the economy, where are you going to house millions of people? And I want to highlight some of the arguments tonight, too. And one of the main ones is that relocation and internment are related, but they're distinct. So relocatees were forced out. Period. Internees went through a more specific process. They had a hearing, all of them did. They may not have lasted long, they may not have had, typically they didn't, legal representation. The evidence, if there was any, was often flimsy. It could be a neighbor. One that I'm familiar with had to do with my grandfather. Apparently he played German music too loudly for his neighbor's likes. And then all it would take would be a neighbor saying, I don't like Schmitz, I think he's got ties to the Nazi party, this, that, the other. The FBI are called to investigate. There's a knock on the door, which is how the book starts, my book. And the line typically was, you know, just gather a toothbrush, a few toiletries or something, maybe. You probably won't even need those. You won't be gone long, was the standard refrain. You won't be gone long. The won't be gone long, I guess depends how long you live. Long can be relative. But it's not just a few hours, but that could be days, it could be weeks, it could be months, in some cases, years. Stunning years. And not accused of a specific crime, not typically, you know, the term arrest wasn't used, you're going to be placed in custodial detention was the expression. So you're not being charged with a specific crime. And that's that. And that's what happened to my grandfather. Then later on, there's more story that I'll tell you with that. But relocation and internment, they're related but distinct. And internees, I found out later doing my own research, were specifically targeted and grabbed because there are tens of thousands of Americans who were being held captive abroad, who were being interned abroad as Germany expanded, like the Third Reich expanded, grabbed more land. Tens of thousands of Americans in the late 30s managed to get back to the United States after being warned by the State Department, you know, you need to get out of there, come back. So tens of thousands heeded those warnings, but tens of thousands either didn't heed those warnings or couldn't get out. They didn't have the financial ability, wrong place, wrong time for a variety of reasons. So as Americans were being rounded up and put in camps, the idea was we would have our own as well. And in many of the primary sources, they mention holding them sort of in escrow was a term that's actually used for bargaining purposes. And there was the not only implicit threat, but an explicit threat at times, if you, Nazi Germany or the Empire of Japan, harm ours, we've got yours. And where it really hit home for me, again, this is why primary sources for historians are like little gold mines, and just of inestimable value, right, just the primary source. And one of them, there were rumors, I'll give you two examples. One was a rumor of sterilization. The Japanese Empire learned that or heard that Japanese internees were being forcibly sterilized. and which had happened in United States history, by the way, right? There were thousands of people who were considered feeble-minded, et cetera, in some 30 states, including Virginia. Those things had happened in the United States. But this was not happening in this particular case, and yet these protective powers, Sweden, Switzerland, and Spain, plus the ICRC, the Red Cross. So in the strongest terms, the United States sent communiques to Japan saying, this is not true. And it was verified not true. But the Japanese, in the meantime, had cabled, if we find out this is true, we're going to do this to your people. And then Stimson, who was Secretary of War, said, if you do this to our people, you can expect the direst of consequences, which is pretty much an exact quote, the direst of consequences, which would happen to, of course, Japan anyway toward the end of the war, right, with the carpet bombings and, of course, the two atomic bombs. So, that was one, right, the idea of sterilization and, you harm ours, we've got yours. And there were other stories of a similar vein where Germany learned that some early internees were being held captive in this state, in New York, in this area, actually, Long Island area, Upton, and some of these camps, essentially they had tents, and the internees were cold, freezing, I think, and so then Germany said, we're going to start doing this to your people. We're going to move them into tents in the middle of wintertime. So there's also always this threat of reciprocity again, implicit often, but sometimes explicit. You harm ours, we have yours. So how far the United States would have gone, I don't know. So the United States, underlying a lot of this too, was a fear of what are often called fifth columnists. So that's another theme, a fear of people being inside the United States, poisoning, plotting, subverting. And yes, there were spies. There were some people up to no good, clearly. And there were precedents going back to World War I, like the Black Tom explosion. So you do have these events, you do have people doing things like that, but there's such a fear of what the third bullet point down, if you read that, and you can read this, of course, as I'm talking, which hopefully the lettering is good enough that you can read it, but a fear of fifth column or subversive threats, and especially by Japanese along the West Coast. There's like a paranoia of what the Japanese might be up to, and it was like a double whammy. The more time that went by that nothing happened, people became convinced that something big was in the works. So it's like damned if you do, damned if you don't. And then people would find these sinister signs in almost everything. One of the most famous were these arrow sightings. People thought they saw like cabbage or different types of fruits and vegetables and things planted in sort of the shape of a bunch of arrows pointing towards defense facilities and things like that. I mean, it turned out to be utter nonsense. But again, when people are riled up and frightened, often the most innocuous of things seems like proof that something is up, right? Something sinister. And then how else would you explain all these victories in Europe, right, by Nazi Germany? And most thought it's not the Wehrmacht, it's not the German military. It's really fifth columnists, Quislings. And if you read John Steinbeck's The Moon is Down, there are a lot of novels that deal with those kinds of themes, including Steinbeck's The Moon is Down, of an internal enemy, like a Trojan horse. And FDR actually used that phrase. He talked about, a Trojan horse, that there are hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, who knows, of Germans in the United States and the Western Hemisphere that had been plotting for years and actually sent agents, FBI agents, searching for these mythical airfields in Central and South America. None of them existed, but many people thought they did. So it's really powerful what fear, I think, can do. So anyway, fifth column. And then this public demand, the fourth bullet point down, demanding actions, and the nation's military and government complied. And it's kind of a perfect storm of what happened during World War I, racism, prejudice, and just wondering how American, if you want to use that term, recently arrived immigrants were. And how do you assess that? How do you figure that out? So the book deals with a lot of these themes, and what I found ultimately was that there's a lot of pragmatism involved in the decision-making. Racism there was, I mentioned a few times in the book, but it did not drive policy. So it really is a matter of numbers. And what you'll see in the slides in a few minutes, 37% of Hawaii's population, not a state at the time, won't become until 1959, but 37% of the population were Japanese Americans, 157,000 of them. And you can't intern or lock up or relocate 157,000 people. You can't do it. So those numbers shielded Japanese on the Hawaiian Islands, just like numbers shielded German Americans. And it was estimated by, I think, HUAC and a couple of committees in the mid to late 1930s that there were close to, once you started counting children and descendants, close to 20 million people of German descent in the United States. More immediately, 7 million recently arrived, one spouse, children, and you can't lock up 7 million people, especially people integrated into the economy and those kinds of things. So when you look at everything as a whole, heavy-handed, and I still think sort of wrong, but the reasoning kind of made sense in a way, right? So not singling out one particular group, but trying to deal as best as the government could with perceived enemies at the time. And now we know what would happen. There wouldn't be, for instance, a West Coast invasion, but the people at the time didn't know it. So the fear of a West Coast invasion, the fear of Japanese. And anyway, so let me show you a little bit more if you've had time to kind of go through that. So the book will have, too, a brief chronology. And what will end up ultimately getting tens of thousands of Germans and Italians, 112,000 Japanese along the West Coast relocated, thousands more Japanese ultimately would be in relocation camps, and 6,000 Japanese were born in those camps over time, and more went from internment to relocation, so that's why those numbers can be kind of fuzzy. But a lot of the planning took place in the 1930s, in the early 1930s, in response to events in Europe, J. Edgar Hoover with the FBI, and this is just a simplified chronology, but you can see 1934-39, investigations began, and perhaps central to all this was J. Edgar Hoover's custodial detention index. It was secretive at the time, and he eventually would have millions of names on this index, on these little index cards. At times, Congress, the DOJ got wind of it, tried to put a stop to it. Hoover said, I'll put a stop to it. What he did was he just renamed the classification system. So then later on he could say, oh, I stopped it, but he just changed the name of what it was called. And then, of course, by the time we went to war against Germany, Italy, Japan, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, in the days and weeks after Pearl Harbor, aliens became enemy aliens by definition. And again, that 1798 Act was just central. Any enemy alien now was subject to apprehension, detention, and expulsion automatically because of that 1798 Act. So then that happens immediately after Pearl Harbor. Thousands were arrested in the hours and days following Pearl Harbor. Thousands, and in part because of that custodial detention index created in the 1930s. And it just got bigger, more expansive as you go through time because the United States wanted to be prepared just in case. So millions of Americans, with or without their knowledge, typically without, had been investigated. We'll talk about 1940 and 41 in just a minute, too, with the registration acts and identification cards. And you'll see my grandfather in a minute, too. And then internment, one other key idea, I never knew about this, but as you study, internment meant repatriation and exchange. The main purpose, I wouldn't say the sole purpose, but perhaps the main purpose for internment was to be able to exchange human beings. Thousands of people were exchanged during the war, thousands. And it was global. So the next book, I'm working on a project now that will look at internment globally, which is just fascinating, I think. And people like us, ordinary people, who through no fault of their own are grabbed, put in a camp, and then exchanged, many of them. And then the last part, as you get to 1945, 49, something that amazed me, my aunt, my father, my family, they were not released, they were not allowed out of Crystal City until July of 1946. So if you know anything about World War II, that sounds a little late, doesn't it? I mean, the war in Europe ends about a year prior to that, more than a year prior to that. Some of the internees were not released until 1947, 1948, and finally by June, July of 1949, the last few dozen internees, all Germans, were released. Many were fighting repatriation, many didn't want to go back to Germany, or perhaps back to their countries of origin in Central and South America, and just this extensive litigation process, right? And they were still, by the way, called enemy aliens in 1946, 47, 48, in a country no longer at war. So a process that really began in 1932, 33, finally ended in 1949, about 15 years later-ish for some people. So again, I will let you read all this as I'm talking. So the Alien Enemies Act. And I wish I could walk, but I was saying I'm going to be too quiet. For me standing still, can you hear me in the back? No, you can't. Okay, so I will stay here. So I know you at front can hear, but anyway. So an early use of the Alien Enemies Act, one which I tell my students about constantly and acted out a little bit, it really had to do with political opposition. So in 1798, under John Adams, president at the time, the Alien Enemies Act was mainly directed at anti-federalists and for all these weird folks coming over from Europe that the Federalists weren't too fond of. One of the earliest uses of this, you can read toward the bottom of that top part. One person, they were out apparently at a bar, and now I'm forgetting, I think it was in Massachusetts, but I could be goofing that a little bit. And and alcohol involved in this, of course, drinking, and this one person said, I hope President Adams gets hit, taps his butt a little bit, gets hit in his, fat butt, may have let fat out of it, but, gets hit in his butt by a wad of cannon shot, ha ha, laugh, laugh, laugh. But a Federalist overheard this. You just mentioned something about the president in a defamatory way, and that's kind of seditious. So the person wasn't laughing the next day when he found himself, arrested and jailed for just saying something like that. That's it. So you have the Alien Enemies Act, you have the Sedition Act, you've got all these acts that, again, have been used, like in World War I, under the Wilson administration. If you said anything against Woodrow Wilson, the war, the prosecution of the war, or a government employee, who would include postal workers, by the way, you could be fined and go to jail. And if the Sedition Act comes back today, which it might, I mentioned to my students I could be a third generation of Schmitzes to go behind barbed wire to get arrested. It's possible. And you think it not, but you read the history books, you learn, and you find out thousands of people who thought, surely, this could never happen. It happened. Was happening and is happening today, I think, very unfortunately. So, and then the 1924 Immigration Act, mainly targeting Southern Eastern Europeans. It was based on 1890 census data, by the way. So it heavily favored Northern Western Europeans to the detriment of Southern and Eastern Europeans, but also Asians. And of course, there's the Chinese Exclusion Act going back to 1882. But if you look at the bottom, too, of this warning of what was often called the Japanese invasion or the yellow peril or the yellow invasion, and white women typically were warned about the yellow man and the yellow invasion. And this language was ubiquitous. It was everywhere in the papers, and not just along the West Coast, but in the South. You'll find similar language in places like Alabama and Mississippi and along the East Coast as well. So this fear of Asians generally, but more Japanese and Chinese specifically. And also the idea that Asians, especially Japanese, they couldn't acculturate, they would never abandon their traditional ways, that sort of thing. So these are all the conditions, like conditions for a tornado, right? The conditions that are developing. And then the biggie, World War I, you can see a quote by Teddy Roosevelt up there at the top. So once the United States goes to war, in World War I, right? We're out of it. We're technically neutral for several years. We don't declare war till April of 1917. But Teddy Roosevelt said, either man is an American and nothing else, or not an American at all. And Germans in the First World War were heavily oppressed. One of my professors at UNC, James Lutzy, told us at one point when I was a young undergrad about 1 million years ago that his last name used to be pronounced Lutze. They changed the pronunciation of their name in World War I. So you can see like sauerkraut, Liberty cabbage, Frankfurters, hot dogs, those sorts of things. The German language disappeared from God knows how many high schools and colleges. Robert Prager, there are lots of German Americans, some of them were lynched in World War I. Thousands of Germans went into camps in World War I. So I think this also helped to shield German Americans in World War II, because World War I was a sort of catalyst. It was this push for many Germans to become more Americanized, to stop speaking German, stop listening to Wagner and Beethoven, to change the pronunciation of their names, and to try to be, loyal, good Americans as best they could. And, this huge push under Wilson to demonstrate patriotism, right, and loyalty, or else. So there you go. And imagine if this was you. And he's dressed up really well, don't you think? So if you're going to be fingerprinted and threatened to go to you might as well dress well, I suppose. So Woodrow Wilson, again, unnatural German alien enemies. Wilson and others believed the country was just swarming with spies. I mean, that's what immigrants do. And you hear the same language from the current administration, right? People are here to, poison our blood, murderers, rapists, maybe one or two are okay. But they're here to ruin the country. And it's the same refrain as historians that we hear again and again and again and again. And maybe there are, one or two quote-unquote bad people, but the vast majority of human beings just want to do what most human beings want to do: have a job, work, have a decent life, have a better life for their kids, those sorts of things. So there you go. Thousands rounded up. Sorry about the uptick in the volume there. And this was global. So World War I was really a turning point in how many nation states treated those perceived as enemies among us. I don't even know the numbers. Hundreds of thousands, I think, probably globally, were interned in different countries, the major belligerent countries, during the Great War, which wasn't really, by the way, the First World War as historians, right? You go back farther, the Civil Wars of 1812, or Civil War of 1812, as Alan Taylor would say, that was sort of a global war. Napoleonic Wars were global. You go back to late 1600s, early 1700s, the French and Indian War, that's global. But this treatment, like how are citizens, denizens, residents of other nations or empires, right, still an age of empires, going to be treated among belligerent powers. So this was global. More in the 1930s, I'll let you look at that for a second. These two powerful individuals, powerful orators, who come into power and exit life at roughly the same time, Adolf Hitler and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And you can see pretty early on, 1934, the McCormick-Dickstein Committee to investigate, and Germans had several different groups. There was Teutonia, there was the GAU, Friends of Germany, Friends of the New Germany, the German-American Bund, Fritz Julius Kuhn. So different iterations, but this fear of, again, a growing Nazi movement in the United States in the 1930s. And J. Edgar Hoover, as you can see, in May of '34, began to secretly investigate American Nazis, along with communists and others. And by '36, maybe earlier, you had the so-called custodial detention index. By 38, you have HUAC, which I often associated with the Red Scare, but HUAC, if you look at that, May of 1938, officially established, and the idea was to search for fascists in the United States, not so much communists. And then 1939, and you'll note the timing, which is why the chronology is so important. The book has got a much more detailed chronology. It's still rather brief, but much more action and reaction, because the United States is tied into events globally. So again, it'll make internment relocation part of a global pattern, not just the United States, not just hemispheric, but global. So FDR secretly directed the FBI to handle the investigations of all subversive activities. And it just expanded the CDI. And at one point, which I'm not sure if you mentioned this at all, Andrew, Eleanor herself was investigated by Hoover's FBI. Oops. Yeah, Eleanor, yeah. Apparently too sympathetic or something, who knows. So some more background and context. So as you go through the 1930s, we're already starting to think, what are we going to do with the Germans and the Japanese and the Italians? There were, by the way, War Department plans going back to the 1920s about potentially interning Japanese en masse. 1920s. So we're already thinking these things. What if? Yeah, Japanese. What if? So the 1930s was just key. And J. Edgar Hoover, DeWitt, and others wanting to be prepared, again, in case of national emergency. So I'll let you read that just for another few seconds there, another minute or so. And the last sentence, right, the United States, or sentences, the United States would have internees it could then exchange for its citizens interned abroad. And indeed, by early 1942, April, May, into the summer, into the fall, the first exchanges took place remarkably quickly, don't you think? I mean, we sort of had our ducks in a row. So here you go, fifth column. And love not in terms of support, but just, who is this man? And Fritz was often used, I don't know why Fritz, but Fritz could be dressed like me, probably better, more handsome too and all that. And Fritz could be, a person you've worked with for years, and he's dressed well, he acts kindly, he does all the things he's supposed to do. But what's really in Fritz's coat, and these warnings of like a chiclet bomb, like even a stick of chewing gum could somehow miraculously be turned into a weapon, and you had to be careful, right? And then you'll see I married a Nazi in just 1 second, but you just never knew who might be a spy, who might not, because these people are really devious, you were told, right? They're really good at tricking you. And the term, by the way, really comes to the fore in the Spanish Civil War in the mid-1930s. And the idea was typically military columns went, or sometimes they went in a group of 4, and then the fifth column would sort of, again, be the Trojan horse that would unlock the gates to let the enemy come within. And then what I sometimes call the fifth column consensus. So it becomes a who's who of people. Roosevelt himself, based on his experiences in the First World War as Assistant Secretary of Navy, believed that there was a real fifth column in the United States. Then look at the list of who's who. Vice President Wallace, and FDR did go through, of course, 3 presidents, right? John N. Garner and Wallace, and then Stimson. But Harry Hopkins, Bullitt, J. Edgar Hoover, of course, Ickes, Donovan, Morgenthau, Hull, Stimson. It really is a who's who. Assistant Secretary of State Burrell, Sumner Welles, Frank Knox, Secretary of the Navy. I mentioned DeWitt earlier. And then mayors, you get to the local, I forgot to mention, of course, Breckinridge Long. So if you've watched some of these documentaries, like the U.S. and the Holocaust, Breckinridge Long is, anti-Semite and sort of a xenophobe. but he's there, and individuals really do matter in policymaking, their personal views, and a person like Breckinridge Long. And then West Coast politicians, others, including LaGuardia, and then San Antonio's mayor, Maury Maverick, which sounds like a great San Antonio mayor, doesn't it? Like a Texas person, Maverick. Sounds like a good Western or something. He actually ordered thousands of machine gun type guns and wanted his local law enforcement beefed up because he was sure, Japanese might invade Mexico or enemies might come in, through the border that way too. So he wanted to be ready in San Antonio, which, by the way, is relatively close to Crystal City. So I sometimes call it a fifth column consensus. The media, policymakers, it's just everywhere, this fear of fifth columnists. And there you can see the tarantula, and not just the United States, of course, but Mexico, Canada, North America, the Caribbean, South America. People noted how close, the so-called bulge of Brazil is to the bulge of North Africa, and how the Germans would just sort of leapfrog across. And there were numerous novels and plays and things that had to do with those themes. And there you go, I Married a Nazi. And some of these headlines, by the time you get to 1940, and they are everywhere in the papers, fifth column dossier, Nazi pipeline, like the boats, right, that fifth column. These are signs of Nazi fifth columns everywhere. Dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of magazines and hundreds of articles over time. And a book, apparently, I wasn't quite aware of that. And then an article, I Married a Nazi, and apparently this woman, she had no idea. She lived with, maybe, I think Hans might have been his name, not Fritz. And she was just flabbergasted to learn that she indeed had been married to a Nazi. Like, he just hid what he was doing so well, even from her. So not surprisingly, by the time you get to 1940, in some of these polls that were conducted, 90% of Americans believed that there was a real fifth column threat. So again, you say something long enough, like you won an election or something like that, repeated hundreds of thousands of times, and I bet you Google or AI would tell you that he won the 2020 election. He didn't. It's just, but you say something long enough, right? And in the minds of some, it becomes true. So 90% of Americans believe that there was a threat. And the vast majority of people, too, believed it menaced the entire hemisphere, because this is what people were being told by news outlets, by what they read, by their friends, by the politicians, and on and on and on. So then we really start to prepare. By the summer of 1939, this interdepartmental intelligence committee, and you can see at the top the different organizations put into this. And eventually the FBI would really be the conduit for this. Hoover's FBI was just this tremendous grab of power by J. Edgar Hoover. And then you can see different iterations, the Justice Department's NLU, it'll change names over time. And then what was called often the ABC list, and the FBI to keep track of all of this. And speaking of primary sources, there's one on the right side. FBI arrests of persons of enemy nationality reported for the bulk of the war. So it makes you wonder today, can I do a quick? I guess I can. A quick little story. So when I was an undergrad at a particular fraternity, Kappa Sigma, we thought as college kids it would be fun to use our fraternity phone, which technically was public. Anybody could walk in and use it. But as kids, what else do you have to do except study and do other things? But we thought it'd be cute to try to call the Kremlin to talk to, and I think at the time they went from Andropov, because we were like, adios Andropov, ciao Chernenko, bye-bye Brezhnev, right, that rolling door, rolling turnstile of Soviet leaders. We tried to call the Kremlin and speak to whoever was in charge at the time. Of course, we never spoke to anybody. Then we tried to talk to anyone in Beijing we could. Then we tried to call Castro. This kind of dates me a little bit too. And then we tried to talk to the Pope. Never got through to anybody. But, and this is true, at some point these men in black, they didn't have the pugs with them though, showed up, FBI agents, wanting to know who was making the phone calls. Somebody was listening. I did not, and at one point I happened to be in the room, and I was like, oh, I don't know. And I will neither confirm nor deny that I was one of the people trying to make those calls. But anyway, in case anyone's listening. But clearly, right? And a panoply of agencies, 5 different ones, and this really becomes complex. And I think for the students who are out there, and thank you for being here, I'll try to ask your professors to give you even more extra credit, especially the longer you stay. But anything you study, I think, really starts to become complex, right? It's just not that simple. So you've got all these agencies, sort of turf wars. Who's keeping track of what? The FBI, you've got State Department, Justice Department, you've got Border Patrol, you've got different. So then you can see some of them: Alien Enemy Control Unit, Special Defense Unit, Special War Policies Division, Office of Naval Intelligence, Military Intelligence Division, a properties custodian of alien stuff. It really becomes kind of complex. And it took me a while to get comfortable like learning all the names, the acronyms. It's like if you study FDR and the New Deal, the so-called alphabet soup, it's like, oh my God, when you're a student trying to learn all this stuff. So all these agencies would have to share and work together and try to be collaborative in an age long before the internet. I just cannot imagine. So then, by the time we're into early 1941, the Immigration Naturalization Service, INS, was examining detention facilities, early 1941, for potential use. So by early 1941, the United States is really thinking now, believing we are going to intern people. How many? Who knows? What facilities? Let's find out. So work really began to figure those practical things out. And then April of 41, and remember, we're still not technically at war. There's a shooting war going on in the Atlantic, and there's Lend-Lease and cash and carry and things like that. But by April, Hoover clarified consolidated instructions. April 41, instructions. And several thousand German and Italian sailors, mainly Germans, but Italians too, were sent from Ellis Island, which I had no idea, but that became an internment facility during the war and beyond. Ellis Island. So to Fort Stanton, so hundreds and hundreds and then thousands of sailors and others, classification schemes, and then you can see within 72 hours of the Pearl Harbor attack, FBI took in some 4,000 enemy aliens, 4,000 of them. So we were pretty good, if you want to use that term, efficient, because the preparatory work had been done for years and years and years and years. And eventually over 16,000, including hundreds and hundreds of citizens who were quote-unquote voluntary internees, like my aunt and my father as children were voluntary. And then Aunt Krista, born in the camp, and my grandmother, to her credit, had the choice of having my aunt, her 4th child, 2nd daughter, born in the camp or outside. And the birth certificate, had my aunt been born outside, it would have been like a normal birth certificate, but she chose to have Krista born in the camp. So her status was voluntary internee. Welcome to the world. So I mentioned Executive Order 9066 earlier. And again, it says nothing specific about a particular group of people, and it did impact 20 to 40,000 Italians and Germans. And if you're interested, these are wonderful books, way better than mine, by Doris Kearns Goodwin, No Ordinary Time. You can see the Roosevelts there. And then one of my favorites that I had to read, the bottom one, for a course I took at American University, is called The Juggler by Warren Kimball, FDR's wartime statesman. And it's fascinating. Never letting one hand know what the other is doing. So he, yeah. And I'm going to speed this up too, otherwise I could be here for like, all night. So I'm kind of looking at the time too. So reasons for it, let me read this to you very quickly. So 3 reasons the book argues, I argue: racism, intolerance. So to me, it's like conditions for a tornado. Will you get a tornado? I can't guarantee it, but it makes a tornado more likely if you have certain meteorological conditions. Same thing for relocation and or internment. So that fear, also racism, especially for Japanese Americans. And then second, for personal public relations reasons, and then national security, the FBI, to identify, locate, which they did a good job of doing that, apprehend dangerous, potentially dangerous aliens. And then third is that repatriation, right? This back and forth, people being bartered. And then more on reciprocity, internment, numbers. And why. And when Biddle and others did the bean counting, you can't lock up millions of people. And then perceptions. One of my favorite quotes is when asked about the Italians versus the Germans, FDR quipped something to the effect of, well, the Germans, yeah, they're probably dangerous, but the Italians not so much. A bunch of opera singers, they're okay. And then, if I've got 30 seconds, which I guess I'm up here, I can have my 30 seconds. One of my favorites is if you've ever seen Animal House, because I like making cultural references. In the movie Animal House, Belushi, right, the fraternity's on double secret probation. They're losing all, the FBI's probably investigating them too. And John Belushi is like, let's go out on one big hurrah. Last big hurrah, right? He said, and remember when the Germans bombed Pearl Harbor? And everyone just like, Germans bombed Pearl Harbor, like, go with it. Here's where it gets weird. Of course, we know they didn't, but at the time, which this is true, according to State and War Department documents, many high up thought they did. We actually thought there were German pilots or navigators flying with Japanese pilots off like the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zukaku, those carriers, right? They thought, and not just Germans flying, like actually flying those aircraft, some of which might have been German, we thought, but they designed, we thought, the torpedoes that could operate in shallow water, right, drop because the Japanese weren't good at that. And part of the reason for the pilots is because of this. The Japanese can't see well. So the Germans can, good eyesight. The Germans, by the way, are good planners. The Japanese not so much. So we had people high up in the War Department, State Department, that actually thought there's no way the Japanese could have pulled this off on their own. And they're Asians, of course, too, right? They're not that smart. So the Germans must have been behind it. And again, truth is stranger than fiction. So just part of the thinking at the time. So it really came down to numbers. And then I don't know if I can make this available, the slideshow, I probably can. But so numbers, Japanese on the Hawaiian Islands, 1.2% were relocated out of that 157,000, almost 158,000. The numbers shielded them. You cannot lock up that many people in the Hawaiian Islands. You can't do it. The economy would have shut down. So only 1%-ish were dealt with. And then if you look at the numbers along the West Coast, same kinds of things. So it really was a sort of pragmatic assessment. And the War Department and others just said, you cannot lock up 7 million people or more, like Germans and Italians. You can't do it. And Germans are too integrated into the economy. War industry. And then, names like Nimitz and Eisenhower, So certain things you can and cannot do. Toland Committee. The interviews and the beliefs. And the thought was, public opinion too, most believe that, the Japanese were the greater threat, far more dangerous than Germans or Italians, and you could somehow, despite people marrying Nazis and things like that, you could somehow discern a good from a bad German if you looked hard enough, but you could not really do that with Japanese, even although there were attempts to distinguish like Japanese from Koreans and Chinese. So you tell a joke, like I've tried to do a few times, and if you laughed inappropriately or at the wrong time, that's a signal you're Japanese versus Korean or Chinese. If you got sweaty palms, if you walked funny, just all this just nonsense, but ways to distinguish and discern. So again, numbers, numbers, numbers. So it really was a shield. And Germans were voting. Japanese not so much. And there were German refugees. There was sympathy for Germans too because of what was happening in Europe. Not so much sympathy for Japanese. And one of my favorite historians, Jeffrey Parrott, had a chapter in his book, Days of Triumph, Years of Sadness. One chapter is called We Lose, They Pay. And especially the Pacific War, right? Battle after battle, so really going at the Japanese. So these early repatriation efforts, you can see the American Legion there, one of these Army transport ships. So 5 actions early on in the war to get Latin America rid of their dangerous people, many of whom were grabbed because they lived on good land. That land would be taken by other landowners nearby. And you can see numbers there. So tens of thousands of people were moved back and forth. Thousands were taken from Central and South America, charged with illegal entry, United States. And also at the same time, thousands of normal people, not internees, were moving across the oceans as well. And POWs too. There's one of the ships involved, the Drottningholm. And the initial push was to get rid of dangerous people. Britain started to question the wisdom in that because these dangerous people were going back to, Nazi Germany, Japan. Britain thought that was highly unwise. The United States at first didn't think so, but then thought better of it too. And then the criticism was of the Americans coming that we didn't think were good people. We were getting the raw end of that deal. So the exchanges were paused for a while for a reassessment by August of 1942. So there was a cessation of these exchanges because, again, FDR was convinced we were not winning. We were getting bad Americans back. They were getting good people who could help their war effort. We were getting dunderheads. We were getting people without high school diplomas, like those types, people who didn't study. So study back there, study in school if you're, one of the students. Other ships used. And if you've studied the Holocaust, the Serpa Pinto was one of the ships, I think, involved in that. Some of these ships, by the way, logged tens, not just thousands of miles, but I think tens of thousands of miles over many years. Numbers. And not just people were moved, but relief supplies as well. And then, again, Hull, Cordell Hull, Long, Biddle, among others, described our folks as non-substantial, destitute, undesirable, lame and blind, not a benefit to our war effort, etc. Along with, by the way, possible spies and saboteurs, like wolves among sheep, coming back. So again, many other reasons for this cessation of the initial exchanges. And that's a grip zone. Numbers. More comparisons, which I've already talked about, but that'll be there. And by the way, if any of you want the PowerPoint down the road, I'm happy to share this stuff with you. So again, this 5th column consensus, this belief in an enemy within. And no way the Japanese could have done what they did without inside help. And internee relocatee numbers, 31,000 plus were interned. And you can see the number of Germans, Italians, Japanese, including renunciants, many from Central and South America. And then relocatee numbers, again, distinct, separate, but related. So large numbers of people. Last few minutes here, then I'll show you some resources. Am I doing okay on time? More or less, okay. So there you go. These types of posters were everywhere at the time. Novels, plays, movies like Casablanca were out there. It's everywhere. Be on your guard. speak American. You can see Eastern District of New York, not too far from here. United States Marshal stop, right, where people were allowed to go and not allowed to go. And by the way, alien enemies, even before the United States entered the war, there were restrictions, flying, travel, where you could go, not go, things like that too. What Japanese would have seen. Yeah, the instructions were there. One of my favorites, this is Collier's about a year after Pearl Harbor, December 12, 1942, commemorating, and there you go. And the headlines were everywhere. Japanese here sent, vital data to Tokyo, FBI seized uniforms and raids. Again, we talked about some of the stuff too, and even newspapers, even President Lincoln wouldn't mind what's going on. He'd be okay with this. Because if Lincoln is okay with this, of course you should be too. And again, the idea that, viper's a viper, a leopard is a leopard, Japanese are Japanese. And there's a famous, I think there's a cartoon, now I'm forgetting the exact year, but this woman somehow in her naivete thinks Japanese might be okay, some of them. She gets a Christmas gift, it's Christmas, from a Japanese family. She says, oh, aren't they so sweet? And somebody's warning her, like, don't open the package. And she's like, what are you talking about? And it blows up. And it's like, I told her, they don't change. They're cruel. And they went after everybody, Little Orphan Annie, the comics go to war, Superman, Captain America. It's just, this stuff was everywhere. So let me show you just very quickly these maps. Right, so this is often what you would see, like just these WRA centers, not much, but voila. So Art Jacobs created this years ago, and it's still not even close to being an exhaustive list. There were dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of different types of camps, from jail cells to country clubs to inns to hotels to CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, camps, you name it. So you've got the War Relocation Authority, WCCA, INS, Pine Island near Cuba, San Juan, Puerto Rico, Oahu, dozens of types of facilities in close to 30 states. So much more expansive than you might think. Some of the main camps. And those are INS. And you could quibble, was Ellis Island a facility or a camp? Some of it is, again, what do you call something? But yeah, Idaho to New Mexico, they're very remote areas typically too. They said at night you could see the floodlights from Crystal City across the US-Mexican border. Crystal City is about 110, 120 miles southwest of San Antonio, heading towards the US-Mexico border. Some along the West Coast. So it does kind of become complicated. And you can see some of the exclusion zones there that were created. And many of these facilities were indeed remote, on purpose. Like Crystal City, even if you could, quote unquote, escape, where are you going to go? So family separation. My grandmother had a choice, right? She ultimately chose to join my grandfather. I'm not sure, Aunt Louise, how much of a choice, of an 8-year-old would have, or my dad as a 7-year-old, but technically they were voluntary internees following the so-called head of family. And then these certificates of identification that you would have to have on your person at all time. And the idea was to make America safe, we were being told. And because of the disloyal few, many must be inconvenienced. And by the way, the Army and others, there's a pamphlet how Americans, it was part of our national fiber to be relocated and to move. So people who were relocated were doing it not only for their self-best interest, but the country as a whole. And it was part of our national identity and being. People just like to move. You get to meet new people, new experiences, and it's kind of fun. Kind of. Because of storms and things like that. That was the analogies made at the time. And there's my granddad. That's his registration card. So you're going to have millions that were registered initially. Almost 1 million were re-registered. And you can see on the stamp there, it's a little hard to see, February 20th, 1942. And that's my granddad's thumbprint. So that was the initial registration. So you wonder why we were so efficient at what we did. Nearly 5 million aliens were registered. Many, of course, were not Germans or Italians. I mean, the idea was, everyone. But we had a lot of information, a lot of data on millions of Americans. Ellis Island. So my grandfather was there for a few months. My aunt, father, grandmother there for a number of weeks while they tried to learn what was going to happen next. There's lots of info here, a lot more than I think you can read or go through. But Ellis Island started to become used as a facility in the late 1930s for sailors. So Italian ships, German ships, Italian-German sailors. Am I starting to, with the time we start to wrap it up, I'm getting that, okay. Okay, so sorry I could be here for weeks, and I know you're only expecting an hour-ish. So let me just show you this. So there's lots more in Crystal City, and I'm happy to share the PowerPoint with any of you. Let me know, or we can make it through the community college. But let me just show you some of these images just very quickly. So there's an aerial view of the camp. You can see the swimming pool there. A drawing of the camp. It gives you a sense of some of the critters around, like roadrunners. Apparently a puma or mountain lion was nearby one day, cockroaches, bugs. And the autogyro, if you see that craft, it was a real thing, I actually looked up. There were these experiments going on. Very quick aside, Joseph O'Rourke, who was the camp's second commandant, he's there most of the war, he actually went to Poughkeepsie High School. There you go, there's one of yours. And a real humanitarian. And my aunt remembers him. My dad remembered him. So he really did. And individuals matter so much in life. He could have been a real jerk. From all accounts, he wasn't. And he tried to make life as bearable as humanly possible. Like, to his credit, from all that's known about him. Well, of course, he's from Poughkeepsie. Wouldn't he be good? I know, I'm trying to, right. So anyway, very quickly to some more photos. And this was, sewage area, some called it Lake O'Rourke. Not very flattering that way. But the pool that was there at the time, my dad remembers that well. Release reports. There's my family, including cute little Aunt Krista. Clearly, unfortunately, with me, the kind genetics skipped. I don't know what happened there, but much better looking. There's Aunt Louise in the far right, my dad in the far left, and my Uncle Bill. And anyway, good student. There's Aunt Louise at her desk there. Probably taking notes, too, I'd imagine. My grandfather playing the trombone. Well, not at the moment, but looking at the camera, I suppose. Again, school shot with my dad, with a little circle around him, far left. Art Jacobs is near him. And my aunt, far right, same row. So they went to school. That is kind of a normal life as possible. There's stuff on Fort Lincoln here. I wish I had way more time. Memoranda, part of a global post-war, which I've talked about a little bit, and then this huge bibliography that I'm happy to share with you. And if I can have just like 30 seconds, is it okay if I show them the site? Okay. So let me end with this, because I know ahead of time you want to do the Q&A, and I've been up here yapping a lot. So if you go to the German American Interning Coalition website, I'd highly recommend it to students of all ages, right? Students my age, students who are, dozens of decades younger than me. And it's this great repository of all these wonderful personal stories. There's this video that my dad and I, along with others, got through a FOIA request a long time ago. And the cassette tapes that the younger generation probably doesn't even know what they are. They're in museums these days. But it begins, you can see it there with the American flag waving and the patriotic music and so forth. And then the longer version, I think, is about half an hour, but there's a shorter version on the GAIC website. And you can actually see video of the Crystal City camp, including these kids playing like Ring Around the Rosie or something like that. How little kids all, like they hold hands, they do that thing. I'm 99% sure my dad is in there for a second or so. Like I can see my dad kind of going around holding hands with, I don't know who he's holding hands with. Probably had a crush on one of the girls too. Anyway, but you get a sense of what the camp was like. It's worth watching. There are all these wonderful stories, primary sources. So if any of you, especially as students, want to do something to impress your professors, here's a great resource. If you're interested in World War II, in German American internment, there are wonderful stories, and maybe it'll inspire you to learn more about your own family and family history, et cetera. So I know I've kind of pushed my time. So good. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Schmitz. We have time for questions, but I have a request. If the question asker could make it a question and keep it brief and succinct. Same, actually, a request of our speaker, too, in terms of responses, too, so we can get as many questions as possible. So go ahead and raise your hand for a question, and Dr. Schmitz would be happy to answer. Anyone?
To what extent was the threat real, and to what extent was it political? And do you see any analogies between what happened in the Second World War and what's going on today?
Okay, that's so maybe the 1 or 2 minute version. So I think there's always a potential threat, right? There are bad actors, there are people who, and there are the Nazi saboteurs who, the 12 of them, I think, right, that went up on shore who were, it was kind of farcical. So, I think there's always a few people here and there that have malintent, but our own estimates, when we started to investigate how many people were active, like in the German-American Bund, right, versus the perception of, there are probably millions, and then it dwindles down to a few 100,000, and then maybe 10,000, and then, it's hard, I think, to navigate that, but I think as a whole, it was well overblown, right? The actual threat versus a perceived threat. And yeah, I think it's going on today, because when you hear, they're eating the cats and the dogs, people start to believe that all of a sudden this community of people are just bad actors. They're up to no good. They look different. The background is different. The languages might be, the accent might be a little off. And people just become scared. And I'm all for, as an individual, if you commit a crime, you do something you're not supposed to do, fine, right? You go through a process. But internees, as were not afforded, due process. They weren't. So it reminds me of what is happening now to, boats in the Caribbean or, maybe the Pacific, that how do you know that these people were bad people unless you really put them on trial as individuals? So I don't like the idea of stereotyping at all. So.
Could you speak, please, about the assistance that was given to the Kriegsmarine off of New York Harbor by people in Staten Island or in Brooklyn watching shipping that was leaving from Brooklyn Navy Yard and from other ports in New York.
Could you repeat the first part of that? Assistance given by?
By German Americans to the Kriegsmarine.
Oh, sure, Kriegsmarine.
Because there were so many ships that were sunk off the coast of New Jersey after leaving New York Harbor.
Right. Yeah, so what, and I'm not an expert on that. So what I do know, though, is of course there were blackouts right along the coast, that some people being people, some went along with the rules, like please wear a mask, get vaccinated or something, right, or have a blackout. Some went along with that, some did not. But there certainly were German U-boats, within sight of like a dozen or so, right, U.S. ports. And I grew up in North Carolina, so one of them was Wilmington. And lots of U.S. ships were being sunk literally within sight of the coast because there are only so many ports, and ships come out of, ports when they're on the high seas. That's something different. So there was evidence that there were some that were communicating, at least we think. But most of that turned out to be, as far as I know, fabricated as well, like people with shortwave radios or things like that. Because most people, I just don't think, have the ability to do those kinds of things. But there was some evidence of some collaboration, right? Yep. So I mean, I'm not saying everyone is innocent here, but it's tough when you go after groups of people who have nothing to do with that, right? Like again, if you categorize Christians because of some Christians or Muslims, or however you want to do it. But yeah, there certainly were, and there were people working more as diplomats, right? That were really spies. Like for the Japanese, right, looking at and watching ship movements, right, the Hawaiian Islands and along the West Coast and things like that. But far more often, you had like accidents, like there's a so-called Battle of Los Angeles, a weather balloon that this person fired at, thought it was a plane. So you were constantly having accidents and things like that far outweighed, any kind of nefarious activity. But there was some, to be sure, yeah, there was some. Oh, I think a person over there.
Were these prisons or internment camps sponsored or managed by private prison outfits, or were they government-owned?
Yeah, so the government, the federal government, through these various agencies, early on in the war, were just scrambling, like what facilities can we use? So often they would use, forts, like CCC camps, which is what Crystal City was. And some of these places had gone through several iterations, like they'd been used, some of them, as forts back in the mid to late 1800s, like when the United States Army was fighting different Native American groups. And so part of that facility would be there. It was reconstituted, reused. But you had places like the Greenbrier, some really swanky places that were used more for diplomats that, oh, wow, I'd like to be interned there. They were really nice. But for most people, it just really varied. Yeah, I don't think the private incentivization was there back then. I mean, that did not exist. There's no alligator alley or something like that. But I think the difficult part initially was we just didn't know how many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions. And very quickly, I didn't mention this earlier, the government thought initially we're going to deal with the Japanese first. They were considered the main primary threat. And DeWitt and so many others said, we're going to do like ABC, Japan first, or Japanese Americans first. Once we're mainly done with them, because they were seen as the greatest threat, like a West Coast invasion, the most disloyal, and revenge, right? Pearl Harbor, the Germans didn't do the equivalent of a Pearl Harbor on us, and didn't have a Navy. They had a Navy. They didn't have aircraft carriers, so there's no fear of an East Coast invasion. Right? Maybe saboteurs or submarines or something, but not an invasion. So the thought was Japanese first, and then DeWitt and others thought, at some point, we're going to round up millions of Germans, millions of them. And then his higher-ups quickly shut that down, like Stimson, Hull, and you can't do that and win the war. And then, DeWitt, just kind of bit his lip, and okay, fine. And so it was much more a selective relocation, both coasts, because you can't lock up 4, 5, 6, 7 million. And Roosevelt was told that. You can't do this and win the war. It was that simple. So it really just came down to that sort of pragmatism. I think if our government felt it could have done it, it would have. But again, Germans were too integrated into factory work and in military units and on and on. And World War I had really accelerated that Americanization process. Well, yeah. Sorry, the lights are like this. I'm having to.
Now, I know that the Japanese went through an intense, like, Americanization and, like, deculturalization process in the internment camps. Like, was that the same for the Germans?
So that's really interesting. So much depended, too, I think, on your previous proclivities, tendencies, how pro-Hitler you might have been. So within Crystal City and many of these camps, there was like a pro-Axis segment, and how much depended on what was going on internationally at the time. So strangely enough, and I know you're going to find this hard to believe, as more time went by, as it became clearer that Nazi Germany was going to lose the war and the Japanese Empire, you found fewer and fewer people who were as vocal in their support of Nazi Germany or the Japanese Empire. I mean, what a surprise, right, as it became clear. But there were still some who were, but most, I think, and I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, I think my grandfather felt this way personally, and you can correct me if I'm wrong later, but many felt like it was a battle between your father and your mother, like they're getting a divorce, they're going through a hard time. And how do you, right? Like if you're from that particular country, and that country now that you have relatives there, right? You might have aunts, uncles, cousins, friends, that sort of thing. You know, my grandfather was asked, as far as I know, at his hearing, which typically these hearings didn't last long, you know, would you go and fight against Germany? And I think in a colorful language, I don't know exactly what he said, but he probably told them to take a hike. He said, I'll go fight the Japanese, from what I know with their family history, but he said, I'm not fighting the Germans. Are you nuts? And he probably used maybe he used some flowery language, I don't know. But that didn't go over well. And, you know, and I can imagine you, or myself, I sometimes imagine, like, what if I were apprehended? I'd be scared. How do you answer those kinds of questions? So I don't know if that helps or not, but it depended. There clearly were some pro-Hitler, pro-Nazi elements in these camps. And sometimes, you know, the dynamics, right, within a camp, those folks wanting to make everyone else more pro-Nazi. But I think most just wanted, like, we're trying to calculate, like, how do I get the hell out of here? What happens next? How am I going to make a living? And as, by the way, the attorneys, I didn't mention this, were let out, the FBI, I don't know without exception, but probably pretty close, told these people, keep it quiet. Like, we know where you live, and we can make life difficult for you. And it would already be difficult, right? Because imagine, like, you're going for a job interview. What did you do during the war? Right? Well, I was considered a dangerous person. I was locked up. Can I have a job, please? It would have been really tough, I think. So.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe one more question. So we go to Professor Flatt.
I'm intrigued by the etymology and the use of the word alien. And you began with showing us that alien was used even in the Bible or whatever, at least in a translation. And yet, and it was so important all during this period, World War I, World War II. We're in a period now where similar things are happening, as we've just been talking about. And yet the word doesn't seem to be as much in the newspapers or in whatever. The word seems to be immigrant. Can you offer us some idea as to how this meaning has it changed, or is it so powerful in a way that it's not being used or should be used, or what?
Yeah, no, there's, I think, a lot of nuance. Again, the Nietzsche quote, what things are called is incomparably more important than what they are. So do you refer to someone as a migrant, a refugee, versus an alien, versus an immigrant? I mean, all people sojourn, all people move, right? People move from town to town, city to city, state to state, country to country. And all these are, of course, artificial creations anyway, right? Nation states they're created in the minds, right? And then you draw little dots and dashes on. And so I don't know, the words to me are important because I shudder when I hear the word alien because it just implies like you're from another planet. When I was a little kid, I thought, are they Spock? And then I looked at my own ears. I actually remember doing that when I remember my ears are kind of pointy. Was I born on Vulcan too? But it does other, I think, using that term, right? Alien, like you're just. And if you study, which I took a course in the Holocaust when I was working on my Ph.D., and Deborah Lipstadt and Christopher Browning and all these other writers, Hilberg, and these systems take years to develop. They don't typically happen overnight. Like from the first Nuremberg laws, 1933, to Chelmno opening up the first death camp in December, right around Pearl Harbor time, 1941. That's 8 years. And of course, what you're seeing, I think, in this is the same kind of thing. It took years to get to this point. And of course, we've teetered on doing these kinds of things. Like during Gulf War, there was talk, I don't know if some camps were actually being constructed at the time to put Muslim Americans into them. I suspect maybe, at least some planning behind the scenes. So the terms, I think, are important that you use. And I've never liked the term alien, because my personal thought is unless you yourself created the planet, which I don't think you did or I did, then you're not, how can you be an alien on the planet that you live on? It just has always struck me as sort of odd. And I get that there are laws, but to me laws can be just or unjust. Like slavery used to be legal in this country. If you look at the Dred Scott decision, right? So just because things are laws doesn't necessarily mean that they're just. And I mean, that gets more into the politics today and other things, but everything is sort of political too, right? Political, socialist, it's all intertwined, economic. And a lot of it, again, what happened in World War II was economic, right? You can't lock up 157,000, 37% of Hawaii's population. Economically, you cannot, well, you can, but then the economy is going to go down the toilet, and you can't do the same thing to millions of Germans. Financially, economically, you can't do it and win the war. It was just that simple. It was simple calculus. And thousands of people, ordinary people, just suffered, I think, because of fear, right, what they're called. So any other questions?
So just as a reminder, before we think we're absolutely going to applaud our guest tonight. But just a quick program reminder, there is an opportunity to purchase Enemies Among Us right outside in the lobby, and an opportunity for Dr. Schmitz to inscribe your copy. So do it. But without any further ado, please join me in thanking Dr. Schmitz.
Thank you, and I'm happy to answer more questions too. I saw a hand go up, but thank you so much.
Great. Thanks for coming.